Throughout the years and all the games, Zelda has stacked up quite a variety of enemies, and as each game was released, we'd get all new bad guys as well as updated classic baddies for Link to Battle. In the most recent chapter of The Legend of Zelda, we saw the return and reimagining of a few classic enemies that until now hadn't had an appearance in a 3D Zelda, like the Lynel or the Hinox. And wow, thumbs up Nintendo, thumbs up. But one thing about the enemies in Breath of the Wild was there wasn't many, at least compared to past titles. Quality over quantity, I guess. But we're all anxiously waiting for Breath of the Wild 2, and we know Nintendo's gonna shake things up. No doubt we are gonna get new enemies to fight, and hopefully Nintendo brings back some of the beloved bad guys from The Legend of Zelda's vast back catalog. So here are 5 classic Zelda enemies I want to see reimagined in Breath of the Wild sequel, here at Z Hyrule Fantasy. Number 5. The Skulltula. The Skulltula made its debut in The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, and since then has been a series staple, at least for the 3D Zeldas, almost appearing in all of them. And this enemy is a sizable vicious arachnid with armor-like body that's always in some form of a skull. They vary in size, but even the smaller ones are big enough to make your skin crawl. In their first few appearances, they were typically stationary, more like obstacles you had to clear so you could advance by climbing, or they'd guard an entrance or path and drop down unexpectedly from their webs. In later games, there were more aggressive versions that would outright attack you, and if you don't like spiders, the imagery is horrid. Though, even the bigger, more savage versions are pretty easily defeated. And besides being terrifying to look at, they never posed enough of a threat to get your anxiety going. Here's the reason I would like to see this enemy revisited. Remember the first time you played Breath of the Wild, before you were accustomed to the combat, before your armor and your weapons were substantial enough for you to hold your own, and you're just minding your own business, strolling through Hyrule Field, and a guardian spots you from afar. And 10 times out of 10, your first encounter with a guardian, you're completely annihilated. And whenever you see its spider-like form strolling about Hyrule, they put the fear of God in you, especially with that dissonant theme that plays when it's chasing you. I can see Nintendo reimagining the Skulltula in a bigger, more agile, and more dangerous depiction, not unlike the Guardians. Imagine a Guardian-sized Skulltula, tougher than nails, chasing you down in a field or cave or anywhere, or coming across a den of Skulltulas and getting stuck in their webs. I think Breath of the Wild 2 can breathe some new life into this enemy and make it just as dangerous as they are terrifying. Number 4. The Poe. The Poe has been a reoccurring Zelda enemy since all the way back from A Link to the Past, and has appeared in over 10 Zelda or Zelda-related games. These enemies have played varied roles and have had many different iterations over the years. They are ghost-like beings, usually having no physical form, or sometimes only temporarily seeming to have physical mass. You can typically find them haunting graveyards, random tombs, caves, and dungeons, any place you could describe as eerie or creepy. Throughout the series, depending on the game, their appearance can differ greatly. In the 2D games, they look more lighthearted, even have a more cartoon-like look in A Link Between Worlds. In the N64 games, they're a bit more creepy. And in Twilight Princess, they look like the things your nightmares are made of. One thing I noticed that was absent from Breath of the Wild that most Zelda games include was any dark or horror-like elements. And that includes many enemies that correlate with that sort of atmosphere, like Redeads or Gibdos. But we are talking about the Poes, and with Breath of the Wild's particular art style and the way previous enemies have been brilliantly reimagined, I think the Poe would be an excellent addition to the upcoming sequel. Breath of the Wild's art style seems to take influence from Skyward Sword or Wind Waker, with a little bit of realism like Twilight Princess. And if I take anything from Breath of the Wild 2 trailer, as well as statements from producer Eiji Aonuma, it's that Breath of the Wild 2 is going to be dark. At the very least have eerie aspects in parts of the game. I think a realistic, terrifying adaptation, much like Twilight Princess's Poe's design, could be both horrifying and wonderful. And if it's true that we're going to get a darker Zelda game, then a reimagining of this enemy would fit its dismal tone perfectly. Number 3. Igor. The Igor's first appearance was in A Link to the Past, and has only had appeared in a handful of Zelda games since. This creature is a Cyclops statue-like being. It remains dormant and still while undisturbed, but if Link gets close enough, it will sense his presence and come to life. Much like the Armos, but it's definitely more beast-like than a walking statue. Its body is unpenetrable in most iterations, but its huge eye is his weak spot, and it is especially vulnerable to an arrow to the eye, and in most versions, this is the only way to defeat them. They are typically mostly found in dungeons, guarding doors or pathways. I personally prefer the versions in A Link to the Past or A Link Between Worlds. Many times you can find them in dark rooms and you can accidentally alert them without knowing, which could make for a difficult situation. Especially if you realize you are out of arrows, they can be very intimidating because they are quite fast and they are massive. In Majora's Mask in the Stone Tower Temple, there are 2 Igors blocking 2 different bridges. This is the only variation of this enemy in a 3D Zelda. They're not as massive as their 2D counterpart, but this version is just as deadly if not more, because it can shoot laser-like beams straight out of its eye. So, it's been a while since there was any adaptation of this enemy in a main series Zelda game. I think Breath of the Wild 2 could do this creature justice, especially if they bring dungeons back into the mix. Imagine a huge statue-like creature chasing you down, and you can only damage it by hitting it in its eye. Much like the Hinox, but maybe not as large and much faster. And maybe even bring back the laser eye like in the Majora's Mask version, and make it powerful like the Guardian's beams. This version of the Igor could definitely be one hell of an enemy. Number 2. The River Zora. The River Zora is one of the oldest enemies in the Legend of Zelda saga, dating all the way back to the classic original, and reoccurring mostly in the earlier games, but have made a few appearances in some of the more recent 2D Zelda games. In the original Legend of Zelda, they were called Zola instead of Zora. Sometime in the game's history, they were relabeled River Zora, and now Zolas are classified as the savage, violent female Zora. Now I know in recent years, especially in all the 3D Zeldas, the Zoras appear as more than just violent sea creatures. Most fans are accustomed to a more intelligent version, at peace with the Hylians, having their own sophisticated civilization, but according to official lore in the Downfall timeline of Hyrule's history, the bond they shared with the royal family of Hyrule and the Hylian race slowly fades, and many Zoras seem to digress into a more feral form and will attack Link on sight. All the earlier games take place in the Downfall timeline, before the Zoras were reimagined into an intelligent race. Now, ever since their reimagining in the 3D Zeldas, we've never seen them appear as an enemy. I think it would be nothing less than fantastic to be able to engage in battle with feral Zoras in Breath of the Wild 2. There are so many possibilities Nintendo could do with this idea. For example, we could meet uncivilized tribes disconnected from the rule of the Zora Kingdom that are barbaric and violent in nature. Or Nintendo could adapt a more tragic circumstance and have Zora soldiers that are part of the Zora Kingdom get taken over by Ganondorf's malice, like the Guardians in Breath of the Wild, but so much more heart-wrenching and devastating. Imagine good-hearted Zoras being controlled against their will, committing horrendous acts in the name of Ganondorf. Every time Link had to slay an attacking Zora knight or soldier, he'd be putting down a loyal defender of Hyrule. It would fit the darker vibes that the Breath of the Wild 2 trailer illustrates. But sword fighting a skilled Zora knight could be an amazing experience. Maybe they can still shoot fireballs and have fighting advantages near or in the water. Adding the River Zora back into the Rogues Gallery is definitely something I hope to see in Breath of the Wild 2. Number 1. The Dark Nut. The Dark Nut is a classic deadly Legend of Zelda enemy that's had many different variations across at least 8 games in the series. Starting all the way back in the original Legend of Zelda, these enemies have always been a force to be reckoned with. They come clad in heavy knight armor and wield a massive blade and have been known to have very powerful defense. And they are similar to another Zelda character called the Iron Knuckle. In the original, they can only be harmed from the back and the side. Their shield and armor keep Link from doing any damage otherwise. Different versions in other Zelda titles, while having small differences, share the same dangerous characteristics. There are 2 iterations in the 3D Zeldas, one in the Wind Waker and one in Twilight Princess. The Wind Waker version dwarfs Link in size, and they have to be stripped of their armor before any damage can be done. These versions seem to have a canine-like head. It's the only iteration that implies the Dark Nut is some sort of creature, rather than a man or a human-like soldier. When Link finally manages to strip off their armor, they become much more agile, and while disarmed, will still fight with some form of martial arts. Now, the Twilight Princess version is my favorite version of the character. They wear heavy armor like the others, but in all black. Battling this variation of the Darknut is a little trickier, for it can block most of Link's attacks and will block them all unless you counter and catch them off guard. Much like the Wind Waker's Darknuts, you have to strip their armor piece by piece before any real damage can be done. And once his armor's been stripped, he throws his large sword at Link and he draws a smaller longsword that's lighter and more agile. In this state, they are much harder to land a hit than before. Now I love the advanced combat in Twilight Princess compared to the other games, and now since Breath of the Wild, the combat system is even more advanced. To be able to sword fight with Darknuts clad in full armor with the advanced combat we've seen in Breath of the Wild is a dream come true. And Breath of the Wild 2 is sure to have some updates on the fighting system. If any of these enemies I've mentioned in this video make a return, I hope it's the Darknut. Not only would this character make for a dangerous and exciting foe to battle, but if the character adopts the all-black Dark Knight form seen in Twilight Princess, it would fit the tone presented to us in Breath of the Wild 2's trailer perfect.
So that's 5 enemies I want to see reimagined in Breath of the Wild 2. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and like and subscribe so you don't miss any new Zelda content. Thanks for watching. See ya.